The hood of the patrol car was still warm from the August sun, and that was the detail Eleanor Vance would remember most clearly afterward. Not the handcuffs biting into her wrists, not the crowd gathering on the sidewalk, with their phones raised like votive candles, but the heat of the metal pressing into her cheek, and how strange it was that something so violent could happen on a day so quiet. "Ma'am, stop resisting." She was not resisting. She had not moved in 11 seconds. She knew this because she had been counting, the way her father taught her to count her breath when the world tried to take it from her. In for 4, hold for 4, out for 4. It was a technique from a different battlefield, decades ago, in a place with red dust and no shade, but it worked exactly the same in the parking lot of a Hardee's in Milner Creek, Ohio, population 4,812. Officer Dale Kessner's knee was in the small of her back. Not hard enough to injure, he was careful about that, in the way men who have done this before are careful, but hard enough to communicate something to the small crowd that had gathered. "I am in control here. This woman is dangerous. Everyone stay back." Eleanor was 61 years old, 5'4", and had just asked for a receipt. "You gonna cooperate or we doing this the hard way?" Kessner said, loud enough for the phones to catch it, his voice pitched for an audience the way certain men's voices always are. "I am cooperating, officer," Eleanor said. Her voice did not rise. It did not shake. It came out the way it always did, level, warm at the edges, like a woman explaining something to a child she loved. "I've been cooperating this whole time." Somewhere behind her, she heard the small, deliberate click of a body camera being switched off. She didn't need to see it to know. She had heard that sound before in a different life, in a different uniform, in rooms where powerful men decided which truths would exist and which would not. She closed her eyes for just a moment. Not from pain, from memory. "Stand tall," her father used to say, back when she was young enough to still ask him why the world felt so unfair. "Stand tall, stay calm, let them underestimate you. Let the truth do the rest." She had believed him her entire life. She was about to find out one more time whether he'd been right. Behind her, 14 phones were already recording. One of them belonged to a 19-year-old cashier named Miguel Ortiz, who had watched the entire thing unfold through the drive-through window, and whose hands were shaking so badly the video would come out slightly blurred, though not so blurred that you couldn't hear every word. None of them, not Miguel, not the gathering crowd, not the 2 other officers standing nearby with their arms crossed, and certainly not Dale Kessner, had any idea that within 72 hours this parking lot would be a name spoken on national news broadcasts. That a federal investigation would tear open a decade of buried complaints, that 3 other victims would finally find the courage to speak, and that the woman being forced onto the hood of a patrol car had spent 31 years in the United States Army and retired as a major general. They just saw an old woman. That was, as it turned out, the last mistake Milner Creek's police department would ever get to make quietly. To understand what happened in that parking lot, you have to go back, not weeks, not months, but decades, to a farmhouse outside Chillicothe, Ohio, where a girl named Eleanor Vance grew up watching her father come home from 2 tours he never talked about, and one court-martial he talked about even less. Walter Vance had been a sergeant first class, a black man from rural Ohio who had served with distinction and returned home to a country that still, in more places than anyone wanted to admit, saw his uniform before it saw his face. He had been pulled over more times than he could count. He had been searched on his own porch once for a noise complaint that turned out to be his radio playing gospel music too loud on a Sunday morning. He never raised his voice. He never lost his composure. And every single time, without fail, he came home and told his daughter the same thing. "They want you angry, Ellie. Anger is what they're trained to handle. Anger gives them permission. But calm they don't know what to do with. Calm makes them nervous. Stand tall. Stay calm, let them underestimate you. Let the truth do the rest." It became something like scripture in their household. Not bitterness. Walter Vance was careful never to raise a bitter daughter, but a discipline, an inheritance of dignity under pressure that Eleanor carried with her the way other children carried their parents' faith or their parents' recipes. She enlisted at 19, following her father's path but determined to walk further down it than he'd ever been allowed to walk. She earned her commission through officer candidate school. She served in logistics and later in strategic operations, deploying twice, once to Kosovo and once later to Afghanistan, where she oversaw the coordination of medical evacuation networks that, though she would never say this herself, and it took a journalist 3 days of digging to find the citation, were credited with saving an estimated 412 lives during her 18-month command. She married a fellow officer, Thomas Vance, a quiet man who made her laugh and who died of a heart attack 4 years into their retirement, far too young, leaving her with a modest house, a Labrador named Biscuit, and a daughter, Renee, who was now 34 and 8 months pregnant, which was precisely why Eleanor Vance was 300 miles from her home in Columbus, driving through the small town of Milner Creek on a Tuesday afternoon in August. Taking the scenic back roads because her cardiologist had recommended she avoid long highway stretches after a minor stent procedure the previous spring, and because, if she was honest with herself, she liked the quiet towns, liked stopping in them, liked pretending for an afternoon that she was just anyone, just an ordinary retired woman on her way to see her daughter deliver her first grandchild. She had stopped at the Hardys for a coffee and a biscuit for the dog. That was all. That was the entire crime. She did not know as she pulled into the parking lot that Officer Dale Kessner had already run her plates before she'd even opened the car door. An out-of-state tag, an older model sedan, a lone woman driving alone, and had already decided, before a single word passed between them, exactly what kind of story he was going to tell about her. Kessner had been with the Milner Creek Police Department for 11 years. He was 38, broad through the shoulders, with the specific swagger of a man who had been the biggest presence in every room of his life since high school and had never once been forced to reconsider that fact. He was not, by every account later gathered, a stupid man. He was, several colleagues would eventually admit under federal questioning, a careful man. Careful about which cameras he trusted, careful about which complaints got filed, and which got quietly buried in a drawer in Chief Roy Hendrick's office, careful about which citizens he decided within seconds of meeting them were worth his respect. He did not think Eleanor Vance was worth his respect. It started small, the way these things always do. Eleanor had parked in a space reserved, unmarked but understood by locals, for the Hardys employees near the side entrance. An honest mistake. She was inside for 4 minutes. When she came out, Kessner was leaning against her car. "This your vehicle?" "It is, officer." "Is there a problem?" "You always park wherever you feel like it." Eleanor felt the old, familiar tightening behind her sternum. Not fear, not yet, but recognition. The specific antenna that develops in people who have spent a lifetime learning to read a room before the room turns hostile. She kept her voice warm. "I'm sorry if I've parked somewhere I shouldn't have. I didn't see a sign. I'll move it right now." "License and registration." She retrieved them without complaint, without hurry, without the small performance of indignation that Kessner had learned over 11 years to expect and even to enjoy provoking. Her calm unsettled him, though he would never have used that word, then or ever. He studied her Ohio plates, her out-of-county address, the careful stillness of her hands. "You got a lot of confidence for someone parked illegally. I don't mean any disrespect, sir. I'm just trying to understand what I've done wrong so I can fix it." It was, in its way, a perfectly reasonable, perfectly de-escalating sentence. It was also, to a man like Dale Kessner, unbearable, because it denied him the one thing his badge was supposed to guarantee him in moments like this: a reaction, fear, deference bordering on submission, something to push against. Eleanor gave him nothing but a level, patient gaze that made him feel, for reasons he could not name and would spend the rest of his career refusing to examine, small. "Step out of the vehicle." "I'm already out of the vehicle, officer. Don't get smart with me." "I'm not being smart. I'm simply standing here." A small crowd had begun to gather. The lunch rush at a Hardee's in a town of under 5,000 people moves slowly enough that a raised voice draws eyes fast. Kessner felt them watching. He felt, with the particular paranoia of insecure authority, that Eleanor's calm was a performance for that crowd, a deliberate humiliation of him, rather than what it actually was. The simple practiced discipline of a woman who had spent 31 years learning not to hand strangers the satisfaction of her fear. Turn around, hands behind your back. Officer, may I ask what I'm being detained for? That question, reasonable, calm, entirely within her rights, was the final straw for a man whose entire professional identity rested on never being questioned. He reached for her wrist. I said turn around. And Eleanor Vance, 61 years old, a woman who had once stood in a briefing room in Kandahar and calmly redirected a two-star general's flawed evacuation plan, without raising her voice, who had buried a husband and would soon hold a grandchild, turned around, placed her hands behind her back exactly as instructed, and said the only thing she would say in protest that entire afternoon. I want it noted that I am complying fully and have not raised my voice or resisted in any way. Kessner's hand found the switch on his body camera. It was a small motion, practiced, almost invisible unless you were looking for it. The little red light blinked out. Nobody in the crowd knew what that meant yet. Miguel Ortiz's phone, however, from behind the drive-through glass, kept recording everything. What happened next took 90 seconds, though it would be replayed, frame by frame, dissected second by second, an estimated 40 million times over the following week. Kessner forced Eleanor forward onto the hood of the patrol car, not violently by the letter of departmental policy, but with a hand pressed hard between her shoulder blades and a knee driven into the small of her back that made her breath catch audibly, a small gasp that the crowd heard, and that made two women near the entrance immediately raise their own phones. "You're hurting her," someone called out, later identified as Deborah Ashworth, 67, a retired schoolteacher who happened to be picking up lunch for her book club. "Ma'am, back up or you'll be arrested too," barked one of the two other officers on scene, a younger man named Corporal Ben Whitfield, 26 years old, who would later tell federal investigators in a statement that shook with something between shame and relief that he had felt sick to his stomach the entire time and had said nothing because he was terrified of Kessner and terrified even more of Chief Hendricks. Eleanor breathed. In for 4. The heat of the hood pressed into her cheek. Hold for 4. She heard the click of cuffs closing around wrists that had once, decades earlier, saluted three-star generals. Out for 4. Resisting arrest, Kessner announced to the small crowd loudly, performing the narrative even as he built it. Assaulting an officer. She had not touched him, not once. But he said the words anyway because in 11 years, no one in Milner Creek had ever successfully contradicted him, and he saw no reason today would be different. He was wrong. By the time Eleanor was placed in the back of the patrol car, gently enough by contrast, once the cameras of a gathered crowd had made him self-conscious, Miguel Ortiz's video was already 40 seconds into an upload to a social platform that would within 6 hours register 1-2 million views. By the time she arrived at the Milner Creek police station, 3 separate videos from 3 separate angles were circulating, stitched together by strangers on the internet with the practiced instinct of a generation raised on viral justice. "The parking lot cop who thinks he's a king," read one caption. "Somebody's grandma just got manhandled at a Hardee's and I am livid," read another. By nightfall, a local news affiliate in Columbus had picked up the story. By the next morning it had crossed into national coverage, not yet because anyone knew who Eleanor Vance really was, but simply because the video was on its own merits damning. An elderly woman, compliant, calm, silent, forced onto the hood of a car by a much larger man whose body camera had visibly and deliberately been switched off mid-encounter. A detail a sharp-eyed viewer named Priya Chandrasekaran had frozen and circled in red, posting it with the caption, "Look at his hand. Look at the light. He turned it off on purpose." That single frame, the little red light blinking out, would become the image the entire country fixated on, because everyone, instinctively, understood what it meant. A man does not turn off the truth unless he is afraid of what the truth will show. At the station, Eleanor sat in a windowless intake room with her wrists still cuffed, her back straight, her breathing even. She had asked, twice, calmly, for a phone call. She had been told to wait. It was Corporal Ben Whitfield who was assigned to process her intake paperwork. And it was Corporal Ben Whitfield whose hands went cold when he pulled up her driver's license information, alongside the standard background, check the department ran on all detainees. A check that this time cross-referenced with a federal veterans database due to an address flag Eleanor's late husband had set up years earlier for benefits verification purposes. Major General Eleanor Vance. The screen read, United States Army, Distinguished Service Medal, Legion of Merit 3, Bronze Star. Ben Whitfield read it twice. Then a third time, his mouth went dry. "Ma'am," he said, and his voice had changed entirely. The swagger of institutional authority replaced by something closer to a scared young man realizing, all at once, the size of the mistake his department had just made on video in public 40 times over. "Ma'am, I need to step out for one moment." He did not step out to consult Chief Hendricks first, though department protocol technically demanded it. He stepped out because his hands were shaking too badly to hold the clipboard. And because some part of him, the part that had joined the force at 22 believing genuinely in protecting people, understood that something in the moral architecture of his entire career had just cracked open. When he returned, he removed her handcuffs himself, without asking anyone's permission. "Ma'am, I am so sorry. I'm going to get you some water. Is there anyone I can call for you?" Eleanor rubbed her wrist slowly, feeling the blood return, and looked at this frightened young man with something that was not quite forgiveness yet, but was not cruelty either. "Thank you, Corporal," she said. "I'd like to speak with whoever is in charge here. And I'd like my phone back, please, so I can let my daughter know I'll be a little late." It was in the hallway outside that room, 20 minutes later, that Chief Roy Hendricks, 64 years old, 29 years with the department, 11 of them as chief, finally read the same file Ben Whitfield had read, and felt something in his chest drop through the floor. He had built the department on a particular kind of quiet. Quiet complaints, quiet settlements paid out of a discretionary fund, with no public reporting requirement, quiet transfers for officers with too many marks against them, a quiet understanding with the local paper's editor who golfed with him on Thursdays. That certain stories simply weren't worth the ink. He had done this in his own accounting to protect a good department from a few bad headlines. He had done this for 11 years. He had never once imagined that the woman his cameras would eventually catch calm and cuffed on a car hood would be a 2-star general whose own late husband had once, 20 years earlier, sat on a Pentagon oversight board. He walked into the intake room himself. "Ma'am, General, I want to personally apologize for." Eleanor raised one hand, not sharply, not with anger, but with the particular quiet authority of someone who has spent 3 decades in rooms where a raised hand meant a room went silent. "Chief Hendricks, I don't need your apology yet. What I need is for you to understand something." She stood slowly, still feeling the ache in her shoulder where the knee had pressed. "I was not humiliated today because I am a general. I was humiliated today because your officer believed I was an ordinary woman who didn't matter. That belief, not my rank, is the actual problem. If your department only respects dignity when it comes wearing stars, then you don't actually believe in dignity at all. You believe in rank, and I promise you, Chief, before this week is over, the entire country is going to understand the difference." She was not shouting. She never shouted. But Roy Hendricks would later describe that moment. In a deposition he gave under oath 4 months later, as the moment he understood his career was already over, not because of anger, but because of the terrible, unhurried certainty in her voice. By Thursday morning, 48 hours after the parking lot, the video had crossed 20 million views. General Vance's identity had been confirmed and reported by 3 national outlets, and the Department of Justice's Civil Rights Division had opened a formal inquiry into the Milner Creek Police Department, dispatching a senior investigator named Special Agent Denise Acaffer, a 16-year veteran of federal civil rights work with a reputation among the officers who feared her for what one colleague called the patience of a glacier and the memory of one too. Agent Acaffer did not arrive looking for a single bad apple. She arrived, as she always did, looking for the file drawer, the quiet place where patterns hide. She found it on her second day, in a locked cabinet in Chief Hendricks' office that his own assistant, under subpoena, unlocked with visible relief. 41 complaints against Dale Kessner alone, spanning 9 years. excessive force, racial profiling. 2 prior instances of bodycam footage mysteriously malfunctioning during disputed encounters. All of them closed internally as unsubstantiated. None of them ever reaching the county prosecutor's desk. And then, over the following days, something began to happen that Agent Acaffer had seen before in these investigations but which never stopped moving her. People started coming forward. Marcus Webb, 29, a black mechanic who had lived in Milner Creek his whole life, came forward first, sitting for an interview with a local reporter with his hands folded tightly in his lap. 3 years earlier, he said, Kessner had pulled him over for a tail light, ordered him out of his truck, and slammed him against the door hard enough to chip a tooth. Over a tail light that, Marcus later proved with a receipt, he had already had repaired that same morning. His complaint had been filed and he was told, reviewed. He never heard anything further. I stopped believing anybody would ever care, he told the reporter, his voice cracking for the first time in the interview. Watching that general's video, watching them do to her what they did to me, I finally thought, maybe now somebody will listen. Priya Chandrasekaran, the same woman who had first circled the bodycam frame online, turned out to have her own connection to the story. One she hadn't initially shared. Her father, an immigrant restaurant owner in the next county over, had been stopped by Kessner's department on a joint task force operation 2 years prior, and detained for 6 hours on a suspected fraud charge that was quietly dropped without explanation or apology. She helped organize a support network for other Milner Creek victims to safely come forward, coordinating interviews and connecting them with legal aid, becoming, almost by accident, one of the investigation's most important civilian allies. Deborah Ashworth, the retired schoolteacher who had shouted, "You're hurting her," in the parking lot, gave a statement that turned out to carry unexpected weight. She recalled under Agent Acaffer's careful questioning an incident from 4 years earlier involving a teenage student of hers, a boy named Jamal Curtis, who had been stopped walking home from basketball practice and held at the station for nearly 3 hours on suspicion of a break-in he had nothing to do with. Jamal, now 22 and working 2 states away, agreed to a recorded statement by phone. "I never told anybody how scared I was," he said. "I just wanted it to be over. I didn't think anybody with power would ever believe me over a cop." Corporal Ben Whitfield himself became unexpectedly one of the investigation's most consequential witnesses, not because he had committed misconduct, but because his internal conscience cracked open in that intake room led him to hand Agent Acaffer something no subpoena had yet uncovered. A private notebook he had kept almost against his own will. For 3 years documenting incidents he had witnessed but been too afraid to formally report. Dates, names, small, damning details. "I told myself I was just keeping notes in case it ever mattered," he told Acaffer, his young face pale. "I think some part of me always knew it would." Each new voice did not just add evidence. It added weight to a growing public understanding. One, Eleanor herself, in a single measured statement issued through a family spokesperson, tried gently to redirect. "This story is not about me. I have resources, standing, and a platform that most people who experience this never have. My hope is that people ask why it took a general to make America pay attention to something that has been happening to ordinary people for years." That sentence, more than any other, was the one that kept getting quoted. Kessner, meanwhile, was placed on administrative leave within 24 hours and suspended without pay by the end of the week, as his own department, sensing which way the wind was blowing with terrifying speed, began quietly distancing itself from him. In his interrogation with Agent Acaffer, recorded and later partially released under public records requests, he oscillated between defiance and a kind of stunned, cornered self-pity. "I didn't know who she was," he said at one point, as though that were the exculpatory fact rather than the damning one. "That's the problem, Officer Kessner," Acaffer replied, her voice utterly even. "You shouldn't have needed to know." Chief Hendricks resigned 11 days after the incident, in a brief statement that admitted to systemic failures in oversight without ever quite using the word cover-up. 2 weeks later, facing a criminal referral for obstruction related to the buried complaint files, he resigned from public life altogether, moving in with his sister in another state. His Thursday golf games and quiet arrangements with the local paper, a memory that the paper's own new editor, hired in the shakeup, would go on to write about in a scathing prize-nominated exposé. The city council of Milner Creek, facing state pressure and a rapidly evaporating tax base as national attention, turned the town's name into a punchline on late-night television. Voted unanimously to dissolve the existing police department's leadership structure and place it under a state-appointed monitor for 18 months, a rare and humbling arrangement for a town that prided itself on self-sufficiency. Dale Kessner was charged with felony assault, obstruction of justice for the Bodycam tampering, and civil rights violations under federal statute. At his sentencing hearing, 7 months later, the courtroom was full. Marcus Webb sat in the second row, Deborah Ashworth beside him, Jamal Curtis having flown in specifically to be present. Eleanor Vance sat quietly in the back, declining a reserved seat up front, saying only that she wanted to sit with everyone else. Kessner received 4 years, with the judge citing the deliberate Bodycam tampering as an aggravating factor that transformed an act of excessive force into a calculated act of concealment, a betrayal not just of one woman, but of the entire principle that the public is owed the truth. The department instituted mandatory, unannounced Bodycam audits. Discretionary settlement funds were eliminated, with all complaints now required to be logged in a state-monitored public database. A hotline, staffed by an independent civilian oversight board, was established for the first time in the county's history. Marcus Webb, of all people, was invited to sit on that new oversight board, an appointment he accepted with visible disbelief, telling a reporter, "3 years ago nobody would return my calls. Now I get to help decide how this department runs. I don't know if that's justice exactly, but it's something." On a cool morning in October, 2 months after her granddaughter was born, a healthy girl named Grace, whom Eleanor had made it to the hospital in time to hold within an hour of her birth. Cuffed wrists and viral videos and federal hearings notwithstanding, Eleanor Vance drove alone back to the small cemetery outside Chillicothe, where her father Walter Prout was buried beneath a modest granite marker. She knelt slowly, feeling the familiar ache in her knees that 61 years and 31 years of service had earned her, and laid a small bundle of white chrysanthemums against the stone. "You were right, Daddy," she said quietly, to no one, to everyone. "Every time, stand tall, stay calm. Let them underestimate you." She paused, brushing a fallen leaf from the base of the stone. "Let the truth do the rest." The wind moved through the tall grass at the edge of the cemetery. Somewhere behind her, faintly, she could hear the small, ordinary sounds of a small American town going on with its day, a dog barking, a truck engine turning over, a screen door closing. Ordinary sounds for ordinary people, which was, she understood now more clearly than ever, the entire point. Not that a general had been humiliated and vindicated, but that dignity should never have needed a general's stars to be worth protecting in the first place. She thought of Marcus Webb's chipped tooth, of Jamal Curtis's 3 frightened hours in a holding cell at 17, of Deborah Ashworth's voice cracking as she shouted, "You're hurting her," to a crowd too afraid to do more than film. Of Ben Whitfield, who would carry, for the rest of his career, the quiet weight of having stayed silent for too long, and the harder, better weight of finally speaking. She thought too of her granddaughter sleeping now in a bassinet 300 miles away, who would grow up in a country that was in some very small but very real way slightly more honest than the one Eleanor had been born into. Not because the world had become kind on its own, but because ordinary people had refused this time to look away. She stood, brushed the grass from her knees, and walked back to her car. This is not, in the end, a story about a general. Generals have lawyers and platforms, and the peculiar, unearned safety net of rank that most people will never have. This is a story about what it costs a country when dignity is only respected once someone proves they've earned it through decoration and title, and what it might look like instead if the calm, ordinary, unremarkable people all around us, the mechanics, the teachers, the teenagers walking home from practice, were extended that same respect before the stars ever needed to come out. Eleanor Vance didn't need her rank to deserve to be treated with basic human dignity in a Hardee's parking lot. No one does. That's the whole lesson, hiding in plain sight, in every one of these stories long before the cameras start rolling. If this story moved you, stay until the very end because real justice isn't a single viral video. It's Marcus Webb sitting on an oversight board. It's Ben Whitfield shaking hands finally producing a notebook that mattered. It's every ordinary person who decides, one day, that calm is not weakness, it's the most powerful thing they own. Stand tall. Stay calm. Let the truth do the rest. If you believe stories like this deserve to be told, like, subscribe and share this with someone who needs to hear it today.